The guides for this, whereas you have the Lonely Planet when you go backpacking or whatever, and what Malcolm was saying actually about the areas that we malign and that we ignore and that don't really crop up at all really in media, like I say, unless there's been a crime or something. But what there was, in the interwar years particularly, there was a real trend for what they call topographical ramble books, and there were a lot of them. It wasn't just the odd one. It was a real trend, and they sold very well. The most famous of them being H.V. Morton, who wrote a series of books. They're not really so much ramble books as sort of vignettes. But these books, when I discovered the first one, it was a book called The Fringe of London by Gordon S. Maxwell. And I bought it on, actually I saw it in Amwell Books, on Amwell Street. It's a fantastic book. And they were exploring places like Monk's Park. Does anyone know where Monk's Park is? Monk's Park's near Wembley, it's near Stonebridge Park. It's just near the North Circular Road. And they wrote about these places as places of wonder and mystery. And they told the stories that were not told about them. And I fell in love with these books probably about 10 or 15 years ago. And started collecting them avidly. I mean, I come from a place like called High Wycombe, which is possibly why I have a tendency and an affection for places which are maligned and overlooked, you know, because people go, High Wycombe, you know, the best thing that come out of there is the A40, etc. And I grew up right next to the A40. And so I had this kind of connection with these places. And in the old Ramble books, they recognised what I saw in High Wycombe. You know, it was a nexus of Neolithic trackways. It was a real hub. It was like the spaghetti roundabout of Neolithic Britain was in High Wycombe because of its proximity to the Ridgeway and to the Thames. So I used these old Ramble books as my guide for the journeys I undertook. Not all of them are tied closely to the Ramble books, but they do crop up, and that's the sentiment I really want to get across. And where it's lovely standing in front of the psychogeography section, because this is the only bookshop in London that I know of that still has a psychogeography section. And although I did a psychogeographical project in High Wycombe actually, but I wanted to get away from the theoretical approach. Well, I think what I saw the psychogeographers did is they took this attitude of the Ramble books, which encourage people to trespass, which encourage people to look for the overlooked, which encourage people to seek information by talking to other people, to open your minds, to look down alleyways, look behind doorways, to examine crumbling old buildings. Whatever was neglected and maligned probably had interest. There was probably a reason why it was allowed to fall into disrepair. And the psychogeographers I see them as giving that an intellectual framework and a political edge. You know, for me, so the psychogeography for me really isn't just bowling around and kind of going, you know, Jack the Ripper killed someone here. You know, it's programmatic. Psychogeography should have an end, really, and that end was the transformation of everyday life. It was the transformation of the way we live in cities. Not quite what I've done in this book. Maybe, who knows? You know, you never know. So the Ramble authors were my inspiration and my guide, and I'll just read you something which is page 1 of the book. I think if you're going to read from the book, I think you've got to start on page 1, and this really got my journey going. I live in Leytonstone, and I thought, well, where do I start? And so I thought, well, I'll go as far east as I can. You know, as far west. Sorry, I'm at the east. I'll go as far west. And so I decided to head for Hounslow Heath after I read this. I'd been coaxed into buying a copy of Walter George Bell's Where London Sleeps by the sheer banality of its title. Surely a book that sounds so boring must be brilliant, as if it were a kind of code. Bell must have thought that if the title reflected the sizzling content inside the cloth-bound cover, then readers would shy away for fear of overload. I'd suspected that the real action was out in the dormitory suburbs, and now here would be the written proof. Bell recognised that lying latent beneath the newly built suburbs of 1920s out of London, there was a history as rich as that celebrated in the City and Westminster. He writes of monasteries in Merton, physic wells in Barnet, a world-famous Victorian astrophysicist in Tulse Hill, and Jewish mysticism in Mile End. But it was the chapter on the highwayman of Hounslow that captured my imagination. I'll skip to where he starts to talk about it. You can pass through Hounslow today and not notice the heath, reduced as it is to just over 200 acres, roughly a third of the size of the square mile of the City of London. But in the 17th century, it was a vast and dangerous waste on the western edge of London, spanning over 6,000 acres. Time was when the heath seemed illimitable, stretching north and south across the old Bath Road, far out towards the horizon, Bell tells us. To head west out of London towards Bath and Bristol meant a hazardous journey across this land that was so infested with highwaymen and footpads it was dubbed the most dangerous place in Britain. Compared with the level of crime in North Manchester, the current holder of that dubious honour, 17th and 18th century Hounslow Heath was more like Mogadishu. On the rare occasions the highwaymen were apprehended, a great show was made of their executions outside Newgate Prison. Then their bodies were hung from gibbets that lined the Heath roads, gallows fruit that ripened along their sides. Each rotting corpse marking your journey like zombie lampposts. Bell gives us a macabre vision of the scene that a Georgian traveller would have encountered. Not seldom a wind blew over the heath, sharpening at times to a gale, and then these grisly phantoms were taken to themselves movement, though denied life, swaying to the creaking of chains in a dreadful death dance. How could I not follow Bell's footsteps out to the bad lands of the Wild West on Hounslow Heath?